My name is Harjiv Singh. I am the founder and CEO of Gutenberg, which is a global digital marketing agency which does a lot of work in the education sector. And we're delighted to welcome all of you. There's a lot of you dialing in from the US, Europe, Africa, Asia, many countries. And I know a lot of other people will be dialing in as this webinar kicks off. But I wanted to sort of really thank the architect of this research survey that we will be discussing today with a stellar group of panelists. And the survey is called From Schooling to Learning, Schooling to Learning, Voices from the COVID-19 Pandemic. Dr. Akanksha Bapna, who's with us, is the founder and CEO of Evaldesign, which really did all of the hard work in putting this together. She leads one of the most important education research consulting firms, which does some amazing groundbreaking work across the education sector. And I'm delighted to have her here as one of the panelists this evening, morning and afternoon in different parts of the world, and look forward to sort of delving a lot more into that. As I said, the audience is representative of a fairly global audience, and I think you come from a variety of fields within the education sector, but outside as well, entrepreneurs, leaders in academia, teachers, students, parents, and yours are the voices that are reflected in this survey, and we hope this is a good sort of food for thought, because this is one of the most important sort of issues that we face in our time, because nearly 70% of the world's students are now suddenly been forced over the last several months to shift to learning online. It has major ramifications, and you will hear perspectives from various experts that we have on the panel. Without further ado, I just wanted to get started, but I'll do a little bit of the sort of housekeeping announcements. We are going to kick off and do the panel discussions for about 40 minutes. I will introduce the panelists first and then sort of ask questions for each of them based on sort of their areas of expertise and their insights. We will then open Q&A. Our host is going to be Sajili Oberoi. So if you can ping your questions to her, she will then share that, and I will ask them in the order that they are received. If you are having any difficulty getting in your questions in the allotted time, we will also keep to our time of 1 hour, and I would imagine webinars any longer than that will not sustain everybody's attention. But we will make sure that your questions are answered. So please leave your questions. We will email responses back after the webinar. And again, without further ado, let me introduce to you a stellar panelist group here that we have today. I'll start with Dr. Linda Nathan, who brings sort of several decades of experience in education. He ran a fantastic school in Boston, has spent a lot of her career writing about education and how we start to think about education as learning rather than education, and you'll hear her perspectives on that. She's also an adjunct faculty at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. We have Zelda Yanovich, who is Innovations Manager at the Lego Foundation. Those of you who have kids are pretty much familiar with Lego, even the adults, because it's one of the leading brands in terms of sort of creativity and play. And you'll hear insights on how to sort of think about that as we start to think about how education and learning is going to change, because it's not just the teachers who have to face the challenges, it's the students, it's the parents, all of us are in this together, and we got to figure out better pathways to how we get to the other side. And of course, Akanksha, who, as I said, is the architect and the brain behind the survey, who will bring her perspective. And one of the things, I've known Akanksha several years now, and have spent a lot of time talking to her about sort of what we need to do, particularly for education in India, South Asia. And she's one of the smartest minds you will find in the world on these issues. So welcome, Linda, Zelda, and Akanksha. We look forward to kind of engaging and hearing more about that. To start this off, I thought what I would do is invite Akanksha to just sort of share her views on the survey itself. We had interviewed about 251 people in 31 countries. Uh, Akanksha, tell us more about sort of what got you started to do this. What are some of the key findings? What are the key sort of pressing issues that came out of this survey?
Thanks a lot, Harjiv. I think that's a great question to start with. Why did we do this in the first place? And I think both Linda and Zelda will really echo the fact that we really rarely get to hear voices from all the stakeholders, particularly from the students. And the survey actually covers both school as well as college going students and those in the middle who are going to be students as well. I'm going to start off by a quote from one of the parents that says, "Learning is effortful, and without a school structure, children default to free play more and more. This is generally great, but the longer the holiday is extending, the harder it is to get them to do anything explicitly learning. At the same time, learning has been redefined. Watering plants and flipping pancakes is learning aplenty." Um, so I think the title of this report reflects this thought, which is we need to rethink what learning is. And are we moving from schooling to learning? And while the pandemic has created a lot of issues and a lot of grief and loss, it also is an opportunity for us to rethink what learning and education might look like. It is an inflection point for education. And that was one of the thoughts as we embarked on this piece of research, to really understand what people are thinking and try and bring those voices to the forefront. So the first purpose was to actually get the voices of the stakeholders out in the open. The second purpose was to try and understand the challenges and the accompanying opportunities that go with it. For example, do we really understand that getting bored is an important part of not learning? And as we hear the voices of students coming through this report, they get amplified in saying that, just sitting in front of a screen is not really going to work for us. So we really wanted to capture exactly these sentiments. And that has subsequently led to the kind of insights which can lead to opportunities for people to design better for learning. And what this report also captures is a lot of insights, particularly from teachers, where they state what are the kind of learning tools they would like to use. We also have a lot of design insights coming from students as well. So this report can then talk to designers of learning experiences as well as content, as well as to decision makers who can think a little bit more deeply about what they should do to enable this kind of a learning environment that is being demanded by the most important stakeholders and users in the system. So those are the two main purposes that we embarked on this research piece with. And I would, at this point, also like to talk a little bit about the research and the methodology itself.
Sure.
Unlike most of the work that Evaldesign has been doing, which is large-scale evaluations, spanning 3 to 10,000 students or stakeholders at any given point, this was a slight digression from the kind of work that we do. And it was quite intentional, primarily because while we have about 7+ years of experience in really understanding the ground in education, and the survey itself was designed from all of that experience, we do know that we, even with all of our expertise, are not going to be able to really design tools which will capture accurately what's going on the ground. So a lot of the questions within the tool were actually open-ended, which require a lot more effort to code and actually understand the numbers. But we hope that that is going to be able to drive further research and use that as a starting point for designing tools and instruments for larger scale research studies going forward. So from the research point of view, those were the two kind of key purposes. And I think with regards to the voices that we are not hearing, I would like to quote some of the students saying, "Learning is easier, better, and more interesting when done with other classmates. I'm missing my friends the most." And another one says, "Seeing people, the excitement of going to school and having new books and meeting new people and having new teachers has just gone away." So I think I'll stop here and I'll let Harjiv take it forward from here.
Thank you for that introduction to the survey and some of these voices, Akanksha. Linda, I'll come to you because you've spent a lot of time thinking, teaching, writing, and really focusing on how education needs to be more about learning than about education. Would you like to sort of share your thoughts on sort of how the pandemic has impacted the relationships between teachers, students, and sort of parents, because that dynamic has changed today?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And yes, I will, but I want to start by just acknowledging Akanksha and her brilliance, because not only was she my student many moons ago at Harvard, but she motivated me because of her research to write my most recent article that just came out in Kaplan, because I was so impressed with a study her organization did about creativity.
Yeah.
And what I realized was missing, which of course she took care of in this study, was the voice of young people. So in that piece that I just published, I actually interview 19, it's not a huge sample, young people to look at what is the meaning for them of creativity. So that just came out in Kaplan, and I encourage people to read it, because I think what's missing always with policymakers are the voices of the young people. So thank you, Akanksha, and your organization. So I'm here in Boston, where 20% of young people have still not logged on. Now, Boston is a wealthy city. We are called the Athens of America. Harvard is graduating tomorrow, although virtually. And yet 20% of students in the Boston Public Schools have not logged on at all during this time. The Boston Public Schools has very high numbers of English language learners, very high numbers of special needs students. As a school system, most schools are between 80 and 90% free and reduced lunch, which is the indicator for living under poverty. So what we're seeing in COVID shouldn't surprise us. We've absolutely broken apart to me, it's been so obvious for all of my 40 years working in public schools, but the equity gaps are just enormous. So what we see is that folks who are living in relative comfort have access and can play and can enjoy with these terrible constraints we're under. But folks who are living in poverty, folks who are in crowded circumstances, may still not have access to technology. There may be parents who are still working because they're in the service sector. They may be being cared for by an elderly grandparent who perhaps cannot help them log on. So I think what we're seeing is just the issues of equity, the issues of poverty, the issues of race, the issues of language, just exacerbated even more than folks were willing to admit. Now that's the negative picture. The positive picture is, if teachers had relationships, strong relationships with young people beforehand, and if technology isn't an issue, then there is the possibility of at least gathering virtually. I don't want us ever to think that that is, if you will, a substitute for learning. I think the virtual environment is a very limited environment. I've been working, I mentioned this to you all yesterday, with some folks who are doing virtual team building online in the digital space, and it's fun, it's okay. Is it really learning? No, I don't think so. So I'm feeling pretty discouraged. I'm in a family of teachers, and my children are pretty discouraged. And all of the principals and teachers I talk to are absolutely exhausted. People are working so many more hours than ever before. And this is with their own children at home. So I think the impact has been devastating. I think the learning loss has been excruciating. And I think it will take us huge amounts of effort to rethink what learning really should look like.
Thank you, Linda, for that. And I think your voice echoes with a lot of the teachers and parents and students on this call, because I think they're all facing these challenges, and these are challenging times for all of humanity. And I think the issues on equity and some of the gaps that have been built up, which get exacerbated a lot more in places like in South Asia, in India, because the income inequality is so much higher, and we have other issues that are sort of exacerbating this at this point. But Zelda, I'd like to come to you. What are you seeing in the UK in terms of sort of what's happening? Of course, a lot of your research at the Lego Foundation focuses on the importance of play and creativity. That's now constrained into a two-dimensional learning, at least with people outside of the home, excepting with parents. So could you share your thoughts on sort of what's happening there?
Sure. So I also would like to say, firstly, a thank you for inviting me. I feel very humbled to be on this call and with all of you around the world, but particularly with Akanksha and Linda reflecting on this, this huge change that we're all grappling with, that society is grappling with more generally. I think in terms of your question though, the challenges of inequality that we've raised and the way in which technology is exacerbating those, etc., we can come to. But I think the challenges of inequality kind of precede COVID, obviously, in terms of inequality of skills development and patterns that we're seeing within countries and between countries. But also where we have concerns in inequality around skills uncertainty. What are the skills that we should be equipping our young people with to survive in the future? What does the future of work look like? What does the future economy look like? And clearly what we're hearing from our economists is that we've got some challenging times ahead of us. And that is opening up a lot of questions for us to be grappling with. So I think in terms of the work that we've been doing in Lego Foundation and the research that the Foundation has been looking at in learning through play is how do we reframe this discourse around a breadth of skills, and how do we think about supporting our learners with developing a breadth of skills through technology or through in-person learning within schools and also outside of schools, because I think what we're seeing and what maybe, if there's any glimmer of a silver lining in this COVID-19 experience is it's unpacking, where and how children learn, and that is more complex than looking solely at the school.
Great, thanks, Linda. I know all three of you have talked about sort of the challenges that we are facing in these times. And I know, Linda, you've been sort of very vocal about how do we rethink education? How do we use this challenge that we all face together to reinvent, reimagine, and reshape education? What are some of the things that we should be looking at in terms of the assumptions we've historically made on education? What are the things we could be looking towards and shaping the change that we need to see in this area?
So I think Zelda, it was beginning to touch on some of that. I think perhaps it's about our vocabulary and the words we choose to use. In this time and place, I might stop using the word school and use the word centers of learning or centers of centers of education. We could think of some good words because I don't think putting kids back on school buses, which is the iconic thing, the yellow school bus, at least in the United States, that doesn't make sense anymore. So kids live near community centers. Kids actually live near schools. They tend to go to school across the city or across the town. And so could we think about all of our community-based organizations and all of our, in this country, it's called nonprofits, in other places, non-governmental organizations, might we think about that sector and the public school sector, even the private independent school sector, coming together and saying, well, we have, let's just take 8-year-olds, third graders, we have 3,000 in this community, and we're going to disperse them to all of these different places. All of them are going to have a high quality, highly trained, doesn't have to be teachers, certified teacher. And I know that we'll get into the unions and, oh my God, the idea of a kid not having a certified teacher. But I think when you're in a pandemic, when you're in a moment of crisis, crisis is opportunity, and we have to think differently. So how could we think about 10 8-year-olds in this center, 10 in the other center, all of them having wonderfully rich, and I'm talking about in person, I'm not talking about virtual, I'm talking about small numbers, but thinking about doing and making in ways that you absolutely can't do on the screen. So all of the kind of play that Zelda's been researching and that we all want to see. The quote that Akanksha started with about pancakes is an interesting one, because of course pancake making can be very, very deep and meaningful. So if we imagine, usually it's I do, let's see, what's the phrase usually? I do, we do, they do. There's some way that in schools we think about that. But if we can think about the time we're together socially, and learning is a social interaction. It is not a digital, to make digital social, it's very, very difficult. So could we think about all of the places in our community where learning could physically take place? And on the other side of that, is this a time where we can finally bust open our deep, insane reliance on high stakes testing? Because that is not the equivalent of learning. That is a compliance methodology. That's an I got you kind of methodology. India is the worst with its high stakes tests to get anywhere. Could we begin to say that is only about getting people through the narrowest eye of the needle and has nothing to do with learning? And if we could sort of do those extremes, one, let's talk about assessment. Its root word means to sit beside, not to I got you. And could we, on the other side, really think about facilitators of learning, not just teacher, but I love the word facilitator, and open that up. Think about the Cuban Revolution when folks went into the hills, 15-year-olds, to teach people to read. Imagine that. Imagine 6-year-olds are not learning to read right now. Imagine all of the folks who could get involved with teaching 6-year-olds to read in a very different way. So I want radical solutions. I want to be way out there, because then I know we'll get into the middle again. But I want us to think about really radical ways of thinking about things.
No, thanks for that, because I think if there, as you said, crisis is an opportunity, and how we use this is going to be upon us to set the direction for future generations. Akanksha, I just wanted to pick up on a comment Linda made about how India is one of the worst when it comes to testing. Can you sort of add your thoughts on that? Because, she hits a point which I think every parent in India has more stress when board exams, the 12th grade and the 10th grade exams come every year. And, some of them got postponed this year for the 12th grade. Akanksha, your thoughts on that? Because, this is going to not be an easy task in a place like India.
Yeah, Sajid, there is actually multiple angles to that. One is there is some continued learning which is going on in the private schools and in homes. And I would like to point out that this report has only been able to capture the voices of people who have had access to technology and who have had the time and brain space to fill out this form. So we really have not heard from those who don't have access.
Correct.
So the kind of assessments, if you think about it, it's going to be very different from those two different groups of people. How do you assess kids who are learning online right now? And how do you assess kids who just are not going to school? Where do you start? And I think, Zelda, you mentioned that there was some conversation in the UK going on about it as well. But I think even taking a further step back, what are we trying to assess and why? And I think the conversation on rethinking education comes back into the center of this. And I would like to actually read out one more quote from one of the experts who responded to the survey, saying COVID-19 is forcing us to really take on the 21st century skills dialogue that has existed for over a decade, now in a very superficial lip service manner. In the given circumstances, children are closely observing their parents' capacity to express empathy, to deal with uncertainty, to adapt to changing circumstances rapidly, to problem solve at home and work. These instances will frame their understanding and interpretation of future skills, life skills, and how they shape our negotiation with everyday living. And most importantly, moving forward, any dialogue on learning cannot afford to be dissociated with a dialogue on skills. So if we also try to think about skills as being center stage of learning going forward, how are assessments going to be related to that? We have done a lot of assessments and evaluations measuring life skills, so critical thinking, creativity, empathy, executive function. And I think a question that I would like to leave the audience with today is, what does it really mean to have, say, a 10 percentage point improvement in creativity? What can a 10% higher creative person really do that someone with lesser creative points can't do? So we really need to think about what these marks or points will really mean in assessments as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. And since we're talking about creativity and the percentage change, Zelda, I'll come back to you, since that's an area that you spend a lot of time on. Have you, either in your own research or at the Legal Foundation, seen any data? I know you had recently hosted a conference to bring people around this subject in terms of engaging and learning and play. Is there, what are some of the sort of key data points that we could look at to say, yeah, you know, this makes a lot of sense to do, as Akanksha just said, you know, we need to incorporate more creativity into what we do. And if that 10% delta comes in, it's what is the impact that would have?
Yeah, so my role in the Lego Foundation is I'm the lead on Lego Foundation's contribution to something that's called the Real Play Coalition. And the Real Play Coalition brings together UNICEF, it brings together Inca, IKEA, brings together Arup, which is an architecture engineering firm, and also National Geographic Partners and Disney. So I think in answer to your question around creativity, some of the key data points, I mean, there are many to draw on, but I think the work that the OECD is leading is shining a light on the skills dimensions and on creativity and how we're thinking about assessments. I found the report that Akanksha is referencing deeply valuable. So the handbook on measuring 21st century skills is something certainly we in the Lego Foundation have looked at as well. So those are key data points. And in terms of my role within the Real Play Coalition and the research that we're leading there, we're looking at the kind of how. So as Linda was talking about, when we're looking at these communities of learning, we've been looking at asset mapping actually in context. So we've been looking at how do we consider that learning system operating in urban contexts. We've just launched a report called Reclaiming Play in Cities. But to give you the kind of broad headlines, that's looking at assets such as time and opportunity, assets around environment and materials, assets such as facilitation skills, and then assets in terms of the broader environment that is supporting that ecosystem, you know, the enabling environment for a creative learning system. And we're looking at those systems as cutting across the household level, the school level, the wider neighborhood, as Linda is talking about, you know, all of those actors operating in the neighborhood, as well at the citywide level. And I really echo Linda's point in that you know, even pre-COVID, we're seeing real value in looking at these kind of hyper-localized systems and how are they supporting children, and how do we unlock issues of inequity within those local contexts, building on the assets that are available. And certainly in this COVID related reality with, as I referenced, you know, the challenges we see ahead of fiscal constraints in the public purse, it's something where I think there's opportunity for us to go deeper as a community of how are we, you know, in one of the maps that we looked at together with Arup, we looked at Kailicha, which is an informal settlement in Cape Town, South Africa. And there were incredible assets, talking of facilitation, Linda, incredible assets in that community of true facilitators of learning. Some of those were school teachers who were running after school elements. Some of them were just community members. Some of them were passionate parents, caregivers. But when you began to understand where those assets were, you could begin to imagine how we could unlock some of the challenges of inequality that were manifest in that community. So that's how we're thinking about unlocking these creative communities going forward.
I think that's going to be something very important in terms of sort of how do you take the assets you just mentioned in places like informal communities or slums in places like India, right? Mm-hmm. So you did give the example of Cape Town, because the impact that this would need to have on policymakers and decision makers and government is how do you think about all of these things which may not be tangible as assets, which is, I think, one of the harder ones. And given that there's going to be a lot of fiscal disruption globally, because every government is suddenly, when push comes to shove, you know, they invest a lot of money in saving the economy. But had we done this in saving education and learning 20 years ago, we might have been more resilient. And I know we see some of the words around resilience and grit in the research and the conversations that I've had with each of you. Could you maybe share some sort of ideas on how we could influence government on this, on using these assets more effectively? Because I think that's the big challenge, right, going forward. How do we convince, whether it's the local municipality, local city government, or even at a federal level, how do you get them to engage around these, really understanding these assets, and what is it that we could do as a takeaway? And it's open to all three of you, not just Zelda. I know Zelda made a point, but I know all three of you are very passionate about this issue.
The question is, how do we influence policymakers?
Yes, yes.
You know, it may be, and Zelda, I'd love to hear you on this. I'm actually impressed with our mayor, in Boston, and some of our city leaders. You know, I'm living in an absurd, disgusting reality with a person who shall not be named, who happens to be the president here, who understands nothing of any of what we're talking about. So I don't want to talk about that person or his education person. But I'll say this, and this is an interesting question globally. What is clear in this country, and we are a federalist country, is without that top leadership, every state is at it for themselves. So part of what is so glaring in this country is without that leadership at the top, everyone's just figuring it out for themselves. And so what you referenced in terms of, you know, what could have happened before, we know in the United States, and that what could have happened before could have avoided the, you know, tens and thousands of deaths that we're experiencing here. So leadership is critical, and we will take back our elections in November. So that's what we can do. And we, you know, I think anyone who's listening from the United States or anywhere needs to fight for free and fair elections. So one of the things that personally I'm deeply involved in is making sure that we can go to the polls online, that we can have mail-in ballots. That's something the rest of the world does. The United States has never done that, but we are going to take back the elections in November. My father is 91 years old. He will not die until we get rid of this person in the White House, because, you know, without that, we're all really stuck. But I think I'll say one more thing that relates back to Akanksha's study, her earlier one about creativity, and I think that Zelda could connect to. I think one of the ways we convince policymakers is actually through the creative work of young people. Mm-hmm. So part of what I think we know is that, and I'm going to use the word art making and creativity synonymously for a minute. What we know is that artists can show us a way through and around in ways that no other sector of the population can do. So part of what I always argue, COVID or non-COVID, is give young people a camera. It can be a very inexpensive camera. Let them document their realities, wherever they are. That is a socially distant way of operating. Give young people books, actual books, not digital books. 30, if young people read 30 books a year, actual books, not digital books, their capacity for imagination will increase. I don't know what percentage points, Akanksha, but I know that to be true. And this will drive parents crazy, give young people a musical instrument. Let them learn to play music. Because when you can play something at a high level, I'm not a musician, but I know this to be true. When you can play something, even if it's all by yourself, although music is a very socially interactive activity, then your ability to empathize, to understand beauty increases. And those are the ways we convince policymakers, through the lives and stories that young people tell us. And I'm talking about little people. Start as young as 6, 7, 8 years old. Let young people play, do, and make. And that's the way we'll convince people. They'll see it.
Great. Zelda, any points from your end?
I mean, I think as Linda was saying that, I just felt like I echoed every word you were saying, it kind of viscerally inside of my body. I was with you, but I think there's been some, there's been some interesting work on policy and policymakers, and one frame that's always helped me in my thinking is to understand the reality of policymakers, that they need that kind of support of the evidence base. They need to know that it's possible. One thing is to have a great idea that's evidence-based, but can it actually move to reality? And the other is social norms, is society with them, and are they in lockstep with society? So I think, as I was hearing you, Linda, I think everything you were saying was so important, because it's about hearing children's voice in that evidence base, which this report does so beautifully, that Akanksha has led on. It's also, though, about demonstrating that possibility, and that society has willingness to make this adaptation. And I fully agree there's a role of the artists, the change makers, the children, the youth movements in society. We've seen it in the work in the environment, with Greta Thunberg. And we know that can demonstrate to policymakers that, if you like, they've got cover. If they do something brave, that actually society is with them in willing that. So I know for our work in Real Play Coalition, it's a mainstay of our work is giving children voice and helping them create the change in the cities where they're living. And I really, I don't want to make a sweeping statement about, the global context or the ways that different political systems operate completely changes the space in which mayors are operating. But I do agree that there is something interesting in terms of the agency that municipalities have, cities have, and in that kind of shaping that dynamism between those different forces of social norms and demonstrating innovation and building an evidence base. So I agree, when we talk about policymakers, we should be careful not to keep that as a discussion just at the federal level or the national level.
Right. Akanksha, your thoughts on that? Because I know you do a lot of thinking about this, particularly in the context of some of the work you've already done. So
I think, so the question about how do we influence policy, right? There's lots of thoughts around it, and I think I'm going to kind of, flip the argument in terms of the challenges that we have faced or are current in trying to influence policy. One is, and I think this report is also a case in point. One of the first comments I did get was, but this is not a quantitative report, so what does it really mean? And particularly when we talk about skills like creativity, critical thinking, anecdotal evidence, or Linda, the kind of stories you are talking about, the ones that actually have impact and influence thought, those are not the kind of stories or data that people want to see. Sure, it's great, always great as an add-on, but never the core of what policymakers would want to see. So invariably, the question is going to be like, how much will this impact? What is the impact size? What is the standard deviation? So we're limited in, and that's kind of a cyclical loop, because we also do need evidence of what is working and what's not working. And we've just completed another piece of research, which will be published shortly, where we've reviewed, I think, 3 continents and about 14 case studies. And Linda, your school was one of them, in what works in teaching and learning life skills. So we've covered methods that include music, sport, tinkering, hands-on learning, and the whole range, and as mutually exclusive as possible. What we also find is that the evidence to support these in terms of causal evidence is not there. So music improves outcomes. We know that anecdotally, but there isn't enough research that says, okay, this is going to cause X improvement in Y. So that's a challenge we face, and that was true across all kinds of methods, and even those which have been established for a very, very long time. So it's kind of a loop where policymakers demand evidence, but measuring that defeats the purpose of the skill itself. So we're kind of caught in the middle of that. And I think the other thing is also just inputs has been a key factor where they tend to invest a lot more, because it's much easier to measure how many classrooms you've built, how many teachers you've hired, but it's much harder to try and report on how much better children are at problem solving in their communities. So that is proving to be a challenge in terms of convincing policymakers. Having said that, we do have governments, say Delhi and Andhra Pradesh, which are actually quite willing to experiment and are working with a lot of collaborations and bringing in civil society experts to actually develop these as well. I think before we move on to the Q&A, Harjiv, I have a couple of more points.
Of course, please.
That I would like to point out, which have emerged from the report. One is, I think that the key importance of the human connection, which is being echoed across the board by everyone who's responded, saying we really need to interact with people, whether it's students, teachers, parents, everyone has talked about that. And another key thing, which I think has much larger implications, is the availability of content, as well as tools which are open source. So while this is a smaller point being made by a few stakeholders within the report, I do think it has very large implications on how we view learning online. And having sort of a very open database or availability of content and beginning the conversation on open source and making it really, really open source and not lip service as it is right now. And I would just like to stop at that.
Thank you, Akanksha. We're already getting a lot of questions from the audience. Linda, did you have a point you wanted to make?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Akanksha something, and this may be something someone else wanted to ask too. Because Akanksha, when you were saying about causality, because I do think, and I think you agree with this, that that's the wrong thing to be measuring when we're talking about how to convince policymakers. If the report is showing that what is so missed is human connection, what would be the ways that we could hold up the skill of human connection moving forward? In other words, that's what we're missing, that's what we need. We knew that before, because we knew that kindness and empathy are critical. I'm going to call them skills, you might call them traits, but without that, we live in a very cold and mean world. And I'm just wondering, as a way of going forward, how we think about, parents, of course, want their children to succeed. They want their children to have an income, but they also want them to be good people, kind, know how to treat others. And I'm wondering if that's what we hold on to moving forward.
I think we definitely should. And there is a sort of reductiveness to trying to measure these things.
That's right.
Which we always, as experts in measurement, struggle with or fail to justify to ourselves. So we really need to rethink not just what we're measuring, but the mechanics of measurement. Right now, it eventually always boils down to either a pen or paper or a multiple choice on a digital medium. But can we think about more creative ways? For example, I don't know, building a Lego duck So many in 5 different ways, right? So can we think about different ways of measuring these than the traditional methods that we've been using so far?
Great, great.
Great. Thanks to all of the panelists. I think I'm going to weave in the questions from the audience. If you have questions, you can type that to the host on the chat, and I get to see that as well. And I will read that out and give the names and have the panelists respond to that. The first question, which is actually a two-part from one of the audience members here, is, was there, and this is to Akanksha, was there anything which was shocking in the facts that came out as part of the data analysis? This is from Sonoj Das Shrestha.
I think personally for me, I did not see the emphasis on social emotional learning emerge so strongly from the experts. It was unanimous. It was 100% of all the experts. And I actually have this right here with me with all of the words.
The word cloud.
The word cloud. So that was actually a bit of a shocker. I thought people would be thinking a lot more about how we work around the digital technology aspect of it. But it was a positive shock.
Yeah, that's great. And then Sonoj had a follow-up, and he talks about in Nepal, there's a huge debate about running online education and banning online education.
Oh,
What
wow.
what does Linda think about blended mode of learning? Is it the future of education post-COVID?
Yeah. So he says that there's banning.
There is a debate going on between banning online education.
Wow,
So
that's exciting.
Yeah.
You know, Zoom is making a lot of money, that's for sure. So listen, I think, you know, we are in a time where we're going to need to get better at online education. It's not going to go away. You know, I run a creativity leadership program, helping emerging leaders become more creative leaders, and we're totally virtual now. So with adults, I think there's more possibilities. And obviously, you know, at teaching at Harvard, I was totally online. I think with folks that are already highly motivated and have access to good technology, it's doable. I think it may even be doable one-on-one. I'm listening to my neighbor learn a new musical instrument through online music teaching. So I can hear, you know, it's just, you know, because we live so close, I can hear the instructor, I can hear him, it's painful, but I can hear it. So I think there's, you know, and he's highly motivated. So I think it's doable as a supplemental tool. I think, you know, but when I think about little people, when I think about 6-year-olds, when I think about the deep kind of imaginative play and in the moment play, I worry. And so I don't want to say, which I think so many people in the ed tech sector are so excited about, oh, now we can finally say, you know, technology rules and we're all going to learn online. I think that diminishes what we've been talking about, the human connection, which is what kids need. So I would like to say something like, perhaps we can supplement, augment, but ultimately teaching and learning is a social activity. It is very hard to read expressions. It's very hard to understand the eyes. You know, we learn so much from the eyes. They're the window to the soul. That's really hard online. So I think we have to be very careful about how we really can go deeply into learning just through online. That worries me. You know, one other thought, and I'd be so curious in India how people think about this. We need to also think about environmental justice at the same time, because, you know, our planet is really in crisis here. And is this an opportunity for us to think differently about how we think about teaching environmental justice? which to me is really connected to racial justice. So I wonder about that. And maybe there is something about online and environmental justice that we haven't thought about. I don't know.
Great. Thanks, Linda. The next one is from Nirmala Sankaran, who's the founder of an edtech company called HeyMath. She says almost all the students they polled recently, and most of these kids go to private schools, said they were exhausted with virtual learning. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, they love the flexibility they have time-wise. They felt they could pace themselves better, ask more questions, which they were sometimes hesitant to in the real classroom. Yeah. So I guess it responds a little bit on the blended learning part that we had on the last question. Any takes on that, on the blended sort of part?
Yeah. Zelda, I don't know your sense of that, but I'll just say quickly and then let you go. A colleague of mine in Providence has said the exact same thing. He works with really distressed kids, and he's a superb teacher. And he has said that kids are logging on between 10 p.m. and 3 a.m. because they're sleeping in the day. And so for many kids who were really feeling like they didn't have a way to enter, they're entering the discussion with the teacher now. I don't know, Zelda, what your research has shown.
Yeah, so I mean, I think I can say on a personal level, I have a 13-year-old and an 11-year-old. I can tell you my 13-year-old is definitely responding to the flexibility, and we know that teenagers need sleep, and school systems don't always allow for that. So she's definitely thriving in terms of her ability to drive her own learning agenda and timescales. But she's, I think, in terms of the wider research and the benefits of technology, I think we can oversimplify the challenges of technology, high tech, low tech, what are the opportunities, what are not the opportunities. And I would like to call out that we've gone through such an incredible period of technological advancement that we've in some cases fallen into a state of being enamored with the next tool, the next possibility. And we let go of what is more intrinsic, including for the learning process, which is what are our human goals, including our human goal of connectivity, and how can the technology serve that? So I think I'm not in the camp of no tech, low tech, or having an opinion on it, but I do strongly have the opinion that technology can really augment, as you said, Linda, the human experience, if we're cognizant about what are our goals and how is that technology being designed around meeting those goals. So I mean, at the cutting edge, and I'm not the expert on it, but I'm massively inspired by the work of Google Empathy Lab, for example, in thinking about empathy and how does the technology augment that human experience. And I would hate to be dismissive about the potential of technology moving forward.
Great, thanks. The next question is from Pete. He's asking, what's the one thing in your opinion that can improve an online teaching learning interaction?
The one thing. Wow.
Yeah, Linda, go.
Oh. Go ahead, Akanksha. I want to hear you.
There's actually a lot of data that has come in through the survey, where both students and teachers have talked a lot about what are the features that they might want to see as part of their online teaching learning experience. And I'll just quote some of them: improved peer interaction, offline functionality, contextualize content, and one-stop solution where they can find everything in one place. I think the most crucial one that a lot of them mentioned was having rapid feedback loops between the teacher and the student, and that has come from both the students as well as the teachers. The ability to ask questions, the ability to gauge what students are doing and respond quickly is some of the points that will enhance their online learning experiences.
A colleague of mine that runs a virtual high school has said that, and he was doing this before COVID, it's this idea of trusting the student to learn. And I think we've been talking about this a little bit. So there might be a mini lesson online that's asynchronous. So you can log on to that webinar, you can watch that little lesson, and then the facilitator of learning, or as we traditionally call them, teachers, trusts the young person to actually do the work in their own time, and then to set up office hours where they can check in. And so that may be, the one thing we may be learning is that teacher as sage on the stage can change, and that we can have more trust of our young people and their ability to access the learning.
Great. The next question is from Seema Verma. She says, while there is extensive data from neuroscience on brain development in early years, and the adverse digital impact we still have of e-virtual learning for 3, 4, 5 years old, and she says that parents are just going by the herd mentality as they see the only way to engage with these young minds, because they are so busy with their competing priorities. Digital exposure is a sure shot way to limit their creative abilities. What is the way out?
Boy, that's a great question. Come on, Zelda.
I do feel compelled to comment on that, but I recognize the challenges, and as a working parent, I empathize with the challenges as well. I think I mean, in terms of technology and young minds, absolutely. Absolutely, the World Health Organization has published on this, and that there's a lot of evidence around the challenges, including around sleep disruption and around kind of didactic experiences, or those where the child doesn't have any agency in the process whatsoever. I think also, though, there are some interesting studies coming from Sesame Workshop where we can see that television, for example, actually does have some learning benefits, and that has to be carefully looked at as well before we dismiss, a child sitting in front of television. But ideally, parents, caregivers, older people in the home have chance to engage with the children in that learning process, including watching television. I think that's when we see the biggest learning effects. How do we manage it? I mean, I think what we know is detrimental to learning as well in early years is stress. And I want to give parents a little bit of permission, because I think if parents, caregivers who've got a number of stress factors happening in the home, and now they're also feeling stressed about giving their child that chance to get bored, as Akanksha referenced in the beginning of the discourse, or giving their child, that extra hour on the iPad, I think it's a balancing act. And I think I would caution us all about, as parents, to give ourselves permission and be kind to ourselves in this process, so that we're not accidentally creating a high stress environment in the home before we get too technical about how much time on devices. But yeah, I mean, the point is well taken, and it's one we're all looking to learn more about as the data is coming out of this COVID experience.
Great,
I love that you say that, Zelda, because I think about my own family and the parents of my 2 grandchildren, and my daughter-in-law just feeling like she can't be a good teacher or a good mom right now. And so I think to give parents, if we can leave with anything, to give parents, it's okay. We're all going to get through this, right?
Yeah.
It's such a hard time for everyone. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Linda, there's a question for you from Shushruti Sachdev. She's asking, can you please elaborate on the environmental justice point? What did you mean by that?
Yeah, it's sort of new thoughts for me, that as I look at the connections in our cities between racial justice and environmental justice, I'm intrigued by how we begin to weave those 2 things together. So in our most distressed communities, in our cities, tend to be the communities where we have the least outdoor environments for play, where we have the most asthma, where we have high incidence, at least in this country, COVID knows the boundaries of race and class. So the community very close to me, I'm in Cambridge, but the community of Chelsea, which is a very poor community, has 90% of the people have contracted COVID. So to me, that's what environmental justice speaks to. And I'm looking in my leadership development program, how do we begin to expose those connections? And I don't have the answers yet. I'm just beginning that line of inquiry. And so I think I'd love to invite people to help me think about that. There's some connection in my mind between creativity, art making, and the reduction of environmental stressors, which is the opposite of environmental justice, and a way forward to think about racial justice. So I'm in that. You can hear me mucking about in my brain. I really want to understand those things better. No, I don't have any easy answers.
Sure. We're already at 6:30, so I'm going to add one last question, which is actually from Jerry Halton. Jerry used to be the former Undersecretary of Navy for Bill Clinton, also president of Poly, which merged with NYU. And we didn't talk much about higher education, but I think this is more pertaining to sort of the impact COVID's going to have on higher education. His question is, in light of the enormous number of undereducated students, isn't online education essential for giving everyone an education? So the justice and sort of equity piece of reach. Arizona State has grown its online program to nearly 40,000 students in addition to its 70,000 of classroom students. This has opened education to lots of people who could not afford a higher education.
Right. Yeah, those are the places that we're going to see more forward movement. I think that's really true. I think, Southern New Hampshire University was really leading the way, Arizona State. But I'm going to say the same thing I said about higher education that I said about little, smaller people. It does not take the place of the relationship. And it was one thing when universities shut down after having already, I had half a semester with my students, so I could ask them then in the virtual world to do all sorts of things because I knew them. I think, yes, online learning will continue, and the smaller colleges, particularly in the United States, that are so cash-strapped will close, but I don't think online learning is a substitute for human connection and relationships. And I think we should remember that.
And I think, Linda, I just want to maybe conclude with another quote from one of the students who echoes exactly what you're saying is, and we also interviewed students who are about to get into higher education, who have applied, making a decision about whether they want to go or not. And they say that online classes defeat the purpose of a master's degree. So, yeah.
Great. I'm sorry we're going to be out of time. We're about 2 minutes behind the 6:30 mark, India time. But as I promised earlier, we look at all of the questions and make sure that we email responses back to you, the ones that we didn't get to. I want to firstly thank our panelists, Linda, Zelda, and Akanksha, for sharing their perspectives and thoughts. And Akanksha, thank you for conducting the research and really sharing the voices of all of the people that matter in making education, or learning as we should call it, successful. I want to end on a word which is actually in Hindi. The word for learning is shiksha. That's what we use. We never use, we don't have a word for education as such.
Oh, that's cool.
Shiksha, but because of, I guess, the legacy of sort of industrializing our education system, we started using sort of education and following test taking and all of those pieces. And I truly believe that, the world needs to move away from the industrial age education to the information age, and really focus on the relationships and the connections that need to happen to be successful in our lives, especially on the children side. But thank you all for being a great audience and some great questions. I know we could continue this for a lot longer. And hopefully we'll have more webinars. We have plenty of data to sort of work off of here. I know Akanksha is planning something around designing sort of learning for the virtual world, and how do you sort of blend that. So we'll come back with more of this and look forward to seeing you again. Thank you all very much, and have a great week ahead.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.